Welcome to the On Adventure podcast with Josh Self. I'm Josh Self, and I'll be your host today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. All of these adventure stories are always interesting because I get to really feel what it's like for my guests in their own pursuits of extraordinary adventure. It's not just the story that I'm after, though. I want to know what they learned about themselves when they pushed to the edge of what they thought was possible. And then, when they're staring the scariest part of the journey right in the face, what do they find when they continue past? So without further ado, enjoy the conversation. Ken Walsh, welcome to the On Adventure podcast.
Good to be here with you, Josh.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've known you for several years through our friend Mike Perkins, and I've heard some of your everyday explorer exploits, but I hope the conversation today kind of goes a little bit deeper into some of these into the why of what you pursue with these different things. So before I jump into that, I think for anybody listening, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and I like to throw an extra one in here. What was your favorite vacation spot when you were a kid growing up?
Oh, okay. I'm Ken Walsh. Grew up in the suburbs of Baltimore City, out in Baltimore County, and in the early years, I guess, one of my favorite vacations was when the family would go camping, because there were places I could get off to away from my brothers and explore some trails and things like that. So exploring the trails was something that I enjoyed a lot as a kid.
Okay, so that exploring trait came out early.
That's my recollection. That's that's probably the story I'll stick to.
Okay. So around Baltimore, were they close camping trips, or did you guys take long distance trips?
No, they were probably an hour and a half drive or something like that outside. And that's what the family could afford.
Yeah.
A little bit different than some of the other people you've interviewed. Didn't explore the world.
Yeah. But you've done a little bit of that as an adult, and I think we'll talk some about that. So we're sitting in Raleigh, North Carolina. When did you make the transition from Baltimore to Raleigh, or what was in between?
Well, I did my graduate work at NC State, and that's what brought me down here. And so I came to Raleigh and said, this is the place that I belong, and realized that this was the place where I wanted to live, and because I could run into people here, that it really was about it being small enough back in 1989 to run into people that you see every week or something like that.
Yeah. It's a little different 30 years later, but still smaller than Baltimore.
I still run into people.
Yeah.
I know where to run into people now.
Yeah, certainly. Where'd you do your undergrad work?
Johns Hopkins.
Okay. And what was your degree?
My degrees are in chemical engineering, but
both?
All three.
All three?
Yeah, a master's in Connecticut, and then came down here. But it was definitely all about trying to move towards the environmental side. Kind of discovered that in my junior year of college, that I was like, I did a summer internship at a nuclear power plant and found that, the environmental side was the side that I was really interested in.
What was it about the environmental side that piqued your interest?
Part of it was about you're trying to get things back to where they were, and it's not easy. You're working with things that you can't really see at that point. So you're working, fortunately you can't see much at the nuclear power plant, but it also meant I was on the low radiation side and things like that as well. So
let's say from age 10 to 20, so the years leading up to Johns Hopkins, if you could give it a sentence, how would you describe that time frame?
The college was transformational for me. I kind of felt like I was taking on a new personality as an independent person when I stepped into college and discovered the outdoors club there, and discovered, people with similar interests in the outdoors, and people who had almost very, not manic interests, but people who were dedicated towards being outdoors. And that really taught me a lot about what I could do, because it broadened my view of what people were like in the world.
Yeah. Any times that I've spent camping, hiking, the people that I cross out there, they're just kind of cut from a different but similar cloth. Authentic, real. I always enjoy the conversations that I have Have you spent any time on long distance trails like the Appalachian Trail or anything
I've
like
spent
that?
times on them, but I haven't spent backpacking times on them. So,
Okay.
yeah, so it's always been day hikes for me.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm referring to is the people that are, whether they're day hikers or section hikers or through hikers, usually they're out there for the love of it, for the love of nature, for the love of being in the trees. Most of them, not always, but most of them are interested in taking care of it as well. So the outdoor club in college, that was some consistent experience of taking trips and doing things with a group of people.
Yeah, and it was all student run that at the time. There weren't all the lawyers involved that told you that
This is dangerous.
this is dangerous.
Yeah.
You need certified guides for everything, and it kind of taught me that no, even at 18, I could lead a caving trip. It doesn't take. You have to be conscientious, and you have to do a little bit of planning, but you can make things work.
So we'll get into some of your caving trips. Is that the first time that you went into a cave was in the outdoor club?
That's the first time I went into a real cave. Yes.
A real cave.
Yeah.
So you have to explain the difference.
Well, I didn't discover this until probably 30 years later, but my parents, I remember, took us into a cave that was called, I think, Harper's Ferry Caverns up near in West Virginia. And I found out years later from the cavers that it was really just a place, a canyon with a metal slab over top of it.
Was it really? So a man-made cave?
It was man-made that way, but I didn't know that as a kid. Okay. And it certainly had formations in it and things like that. But it was definitely, I was surprised to find that out 30 years later.
Childhood dreams shattered.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, cool. So one of the things I'm interested in is as people pursue exploring an adventure, is it an individual effort or is it something that you enjoy doing as a group? And you were telling me earlier, from a safety standpoint, sometimes a group is necessary, but
always necessary.
Okay. Is that your preference? Like if you could, safety aside, if you could go out and do these things on your own, would you?
I still would do them in a group. I think that there are times in a cave where I can sit and spend some time on my own while I can hear the group off in the distance. And that we can get into that. That's some of the mapping the caves a little bit later. But I think that my preference is to have moments like that, but not to have the 8-hour caving trip or 17-hour caving trip. No, I can't imagine wanting to be strictly on my own through that.
Yeah. Let's set caving aside for a second. I mean, you said a second ago you've done day hikes, and I know that you've also taken trips around the world to see different places. In those exploits, do you tend to lean towards doing that yourself, or do you also like being in a group for that kind of stuff?
Both. I took a trip out to Arches National Park as well as the Canyonlands, and I broke that trip up into different pieces, visiting friends in Colorado along the way, flying in and out of Denver, but then taking some friends out to Arches. But then I wanted to learn photography. So I wanted to learn the desert photography and did not need to have people standing around waiting for me. So the rest of that week I took off on my own and enjoyed the trip on my own in the Needles district of Canyonlands and over and throughout Arches, just being able to set up the shots, take the time to do the photography I wanted to do.
Did you have any training before doing that, or was it just learn as you go?
I did not have any training. I mean, I've had some training in cave photography, but that's about the only training I've had photographically.
Well, that's really, that kind of gets to something else too, that you're learning something new. Like
always.
Yeah. So say a little bit more about that. I know you to be a very smart guy. I know you to be very capable at a lot of different things. Photography, though, I mean, that's a challenge. Why do you look for something new to learn?
My belief is that we're always looking to learn, and I try to emphasize that with the kids I volunteer with, that it's a lifelong, I know people talk about lifelong learning, but I think that's what our weekends are for.
Yeah.
As well as, in my case, I'm a consultant, so I'm always learning something new, and I enjoy being exposed to new information. I wouldn't want to do the same project twice. When I go to the caves, I'm always looking forward to what I might see next that I haven't seen before. And that might be, I might be going into the same passage I've been in before, but I've never looked at this wall very closely or something like that.
Is that an intentional thing that you do when you go into something for a second, third, or 20th time?
Well, a lot of times I'm mapping the caves. And so one of the things I learned about mapping is that there might just be a tiny little hole that no one noticed before because they just kept walking down the big borehole passageways. And it's great if there is something new to be found. It might just be through that tiny little hole that you squeeze through and opens up on the other side.
You mentioned this just a second ago, volunteer work with kids. I know that you've done work with the Governor Moorhead Foundation. Are you still doing work with the foundation?
I work with the Governor Moorhead School.
The school.
Right.
Yes.
The foundation is kind of oversees funding projects that they do and helps them out with introducing the kids to things that they wouldn't be exposed to, even if that's just taking them to see a hockey game or something like that. Just helping out with the funding that they need to go to the state fair. And that's an enormous experience for a lot of the kids I work with. And for me, it's an incredible experience to go to the state fair and be the interpreter because there are all kinds of noises, there are all kinds of smells and taste and things like that that the visually impaired and blind students can't take in what this is unless you're kind of translating for them or helping to interpret. No, that's what you're smelling over there is the deep fried bananas and things like that.
Then they say, what is that?
Right. And then we see if that's something that they're willing to try.
Yeah.
And the places where they're willing to try, some of the students are more willing to try things than others, but it's great to work with them.
How long have you worked with the school?
Since the early 90s.
Okay. So you'd say it's a passion that you enjoy doing?
It's a passion, but it's also it's a community there. It's a deep, nurturing family that they've created there because it's a residential school. So as a residential school that the kids just go home on weekends, it provides them with a great way of, not sure how to say this. It's a community that once you become part of, you have an interest in seeing the kids grow.
I see.
And so I've seen them grow from 6 years into 40 years, 6 years old up into 40 years old.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that along the way and stay in touch with some of them along the way.
What got you involved in the first place?
I was at NC State and needed to get away from the academics in the ivory tower. I needed to get away from the people who believed that their research was the most important thing in the world and not fall into some of those traps. And I guess the ivory tower analogy was I just didn't feel at place quite the same way. Where when I walked across the park to where the school's located, I suddenly felt not just welcome, but I felt like these were people that had the same background that I had and my dad was a steel worker. So it's not the same dealing with people like that as dealing with people with common backgrounds as it was dealing with people in the academic world.
Yeah, in the ivory tower.
Right.
No, that makes total sense. Do you do any other volunteer work, or is all of it focused on the school?
I do volunteer other places, but the school has really been the thing that is most important to me. I certainly volunteer with theater groups occasionally, but that's ushering, and I won't volunteer to take on some of those bigger duties that like I do at the school with tutoring and tutoring math subjects and things like that. And, I will lead a lot of caving trips for beginners and talking to scouts and scout leaders in a few weeks and things like that.
All right, very cool. But I don't want to skip over the fact that you are involved with theater, that you've had a screenplay produced and
Stage play.
Yeah, not screenplay, stage play. And to me, that, again, like a creative outlet, somewhat risky thing to do, to put your soul into something and have people see it and decide whether they like it or not. That's adventure too. So before we get into the caves and exploring different parts above ground and below ground, if you wouldn't mind, spend a couple minutes telling me a little bit about what the whole experience has been writing and producing something from start to scratch.
Okay. And I'm just going to start that I was not the producer. And the reason why I say that is because, someone could self-produce something. And I know a lot of people who self-produce their plays, but to me, it's almost like you're cheating at that point.
So you
because
wrote it.
I wanted to make sure that someone else was interested in producing my play, because that's kind of where I was. I write lots of plays, but most of them don't even deserve to be produced. But occasionally I'll come across a good nugget and things like that. But I think my process started for actually writing the plays back in 2010, but back through high school and back through college, which were many years ago. I even took a playwriting class in college and took several classes in creative writing in college. So that was my creative outlet at that point. And over the years, I dropped a lot of the creative writing, but because my job required so much writing.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I was interpreting science and interpreting a lot of concepts in my writing. And so it took me a while to find my way back to the creative writing. And then I ran into and realized that a friend of mine was raising 3 children, working full time, running the Cary Playwrights Forum, and still found time to write. And I said, well, you have no excuse not to be writing.
It always helps to have a little perspective.
Right. So I said, okay, I can make the time to do this myself, and started exploring the writing again. And it's one of those things I can do more during the summer when the kids are out of school.
Gotcha.
And kind of focus on. And I've started writing very small pieces, and up through a lot of 10-minute pieces, 3-minute pieces even of plays, and enjoyed writing them and exploring them as an engineer, because doing a stage play, you have lots of restrictions. Everything has to take place in one scene. Everything has to take place that you can't have characters flying around on stage, things like that. And you don't always know who the actors are going to be. So you have to write things so that they are actor-proof, even, that as long as the director knows what they're trying for, they'll be able to get the points across. And so those have been produced in bars and cemeteries and things like that, the short pieces. But this summer was the first time, and including I had a full-length play that I wrote one time and found out that it was not a stage play, much to my dismay. It was much better as an audio play. And so Cary Playwrights Forum actually produced it as a 4-part podcast.
Really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
And they produced it during the pandemic, and everyone, unfortunately, was stuck in their reading to a microphone or blindly at home. And
that would be difficult.
But then it was all pasted together and
it turned
wonderfully.
Out good.
Turned out great.
Really
I really respect the director, producer for that. He did a great job with it. But then the full-length play that was just produced this summer was really pretty special to me in terms of pulling together a full-length comedy was a challenge, to get that down to a 75, 80-minute play that takes place in just 2 scenes.
Wow. With
5 characters all coming in and out of the stage and trying to pull off this big story that all 5 of them have interest in, and still making it satisfying for the audience, making sure they didn't walk away saying, well, I still want to know if this happened.
Yeah.
Closing it out.
Was this a lifelong goal, or did you get to this through just a million different iterations that as you've pursued the creative outlet?
I think I knew that there were some stories I wanted to write. I honestly couldn't say that my writing is basically for sitting around in a big living room and letting the actor friends of mine read it and everybody getting a couple of laughs. And that's kind of my goal. And that's not a high bar to set. I'm not so interested in setting it out as a goal, but this was one script that was special enough to me. And when I started sharing it with other people, they were like, oh no, you need to keep working on this. And you need to make sure that this goes to this person and goes to that person. And eventually, hopefully, it'll get produced.
That's really cool. So what do you get out of this creative outlet?
I get to explore those 5 characters. I get to explore how they would roll into and how they would deal with this terrible situation that's thrown upon them in a comedic way. But I also get to look at what makes people laugh.
Is this a way for you to kind of explore your real world around you and things that happen, or is it just something in your head that needs to get out?
Well, the characters, I like letting the characters out and exploring them, because I have to go in depth about the characters, and I really get to get inside their heads and explore those characters. I do let the stories guide themselves, and that was something I learned in my writing classes. It's like, listen to the characters and where they go and be surprised at what you find.
So there's a level of curiosity that in what you're saying, without a preconceived notion of what the end result is going to look like.
True.
That's
an accurate assessment?
Okay.
Yeah.
And as I say that, I can see how that also plays out in your exploring caves, right? I mean,
exactly.
You don't know how it's going to end. It's a creative pursuit. Maybe another way to say it is you don't know where the cave ends necessarily all the time. If you're going in to map it, or you're going in to see something new or see something you've seen before in a new light, in a different way, it's kind of the same idea of being curious and seeing where the story goes. So I'm seeing consistency in what you do in a couple different venues, whether it's your service with the kids or your creative outlet with theater, and then also with exploring caves. And I think we'll probably spend most of the rest of the time talking about caves, but I know that you've spent other time exploring different parts of the world as well. But let's kind of jump into caves. You mentioned a second ago, you first real cave in college. I know that you lead groups now into caves. Almost, I don't know if you would consider yourself a teacher, but as teaching people of different skill levels, what it means to get underground and what they can find. Maybe talk a little bit about why you love getting into caves. And I'm sure it ties into your environmental science background and the curiosity, but maybe try to answer that question a little bit. Why do you enjoy doing it?
Well, tying it into environmental science is a hard one, since that goes off in a lot of different directions. I will mention briefly that at NC State, I took a class in chemical oceanography and did very well in the class, but I didn't have a background in oceanography. And it was amazing to see all the layers being deposited, because that's what I see in the caves in the long run. So to me, it was easy to express my interest, because I already had the interest in caves at that point.
Okay.
In terms of the exploring and curiosity, one other sport that I'm interested in is orienteering, where you're given a map, but you're looking at very unfamiliar terrain. And trying to interpret what the map symbols mean with your compass along the way. But I think where I'd go with your discussion, I'm going to ask you to ask the question again.
A little differently.
Yeah. Or ask it, just repeat it, because I think I've lost.
So why do you pursue, and orienteering could be a great way to answer the question too, what do you love or what do you enjoy about being in a cave or a map without any directions? What is it about those things that make you go, I love this, I can't wait to do it again?
I think the fact that my brain's engaged the whole time. So I really like the fact that even if we are experiencing just that sense of awe, that's a brain function. If we're reading a map, if we're doing cartography, all of those things I find very appealing. Went back when I was later in college, I think, and my parents shared with me one of those tests of what should you be when you grow up. And I think I took it when I was 12 years old.
Okay.
And it had two answers that probably fit into my underground explorations. One of them was a cartographer.
Really?
And the second one was a mortician. So,
how does that fit in?
well, that's underground.
Okay. I guess so. I guess it is.
But those were
funny.
kind of things that I guess I was being drawn to, and some of it is being drawn to spatial analysis and things like that. That isn't what everyone's drawn to, but I'm definitely oriented towards things that have maps or can be mapped out.
Gotcha.
The work with the kids at the school, I mean, until you've done Braille geometry, you really haven't explored a geometry problem from high school until you consider it in Braille, taking in one piece at a time.
Wow, that's really cool. But you're basically saying that's the way your brain is wired, and you enjoy engaging it in that way. You said something a second ago too about a sense of awe, and I've had that common thread among a lot of these conversations of being able to get outside of the concrete jungles and the routine of the everyday into open space or closed space, but the natural space to get that sense of, man, I'm really small. This universe is so big. Getting that kind of perspective, but do you get that feeling, that sense of awe when you do all of these kind of different things, or is it a little more elusive?
I don't think it's elusive, and even through the plays and things like that, when the characters discover something, I enjoy discovering it with them. Even if it's fictional characters or real characters. I have to do research for cemetery plays, but I really enjoy the looking a little bit deeper, and sometimes they're just very small things. In the caves as well, I can sit and look at a small gypsum flower and just admire the way that the crystals are turning in this 1/4 inch high formation. And that's one of the things that I get to do when I'm on a trip with beginners that I wouldn't normally get to do, because I'd be looking at the bigger picture and moving a little bit faster and things like that. But being able to stop and admire the frogs that are a few hundred feet underground, probably they were just washed in and food gets washed into them. But
interesting,
there are lots of little things that are surprises. And I may go back multiple times and see different things at the same places, or I might go somewhere new. And lots of time I really like going to new places, but that they also have a sense of, am I going to fit? Am I going, what are the challenges going to be on getting there?
So you can't boil this down to a formula, but I'm going to
do it anyway.
Do it anyway. Your sense of curiosity, what you just described is kind of a beginner's mind, right? And whether it's intentional or being forced because you're leading beginners to stop and pay attention to what's around, gets to the sense of awe and wonder, which is hard to manufacture. The other thing that I hear you saying too is when you're paying attention to the flower or the frogs or teaching a kid Braille geometry, the only way to do that is by paying attention to where your feet are. Like this moment right now, not what's going to happen in 10 minutes or 5 years, and not worrying about what happened in the past. It's being completely present. And again, maybe if that's part of the formula too, of staying present in the moment. Again, I'm not trying to boil it down to the same formula for everybody, but I'm hearing these different things in every story that you're telling, whether it's about caving or working with the kids or writing your stage play. It's a lot of the same
experiences.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And being in the present, there's certainly more delight in being in the present than there is in the looking forward
yeah.
in general and things like that. Not to say that when I go traveling, I do like to plan the trips. I enjoy saying, oh, what might this be like and things like that. But a slightly different process than when you're actually there. So I can enjoy both from that point of view. But like I said, when I was talking about the plays, it's like, no, this isn't about what it's going to be and how it's going to look in the future. It's about what's going on right now.
Gotcha. Well, so let's dive a little deeper into your cave adventures. Without asking, maybe pick one of your most enjoyable trips or things that you got. I don't want to pose it in terms of favorite or even enjoyable, but what I want to know is when you do something deep in a cave that you really are fully engaged and fully enjoying, what are you doing? What are the things that go into from the time you walk into the mouth of the cave or dive into it? What are you doing in those moments?
What am I doing in those moments? I am...
Because there's going to be a lot of people listening to this that have never been in a cave, don't know how do you even do it? So, if you want to talk about specifically how you get through a cave or more kind of ethereal, what the experience is like, either one would be fine.
Okay. Well, I'll talk first about an experience that I had when I was a junior in college. And so 20 years old, there was a cave that had been opened by a backhoe because they knew there was a cave in the area. They knew that the water was draining in the area. And the first thing that they found inside the entrance was the skull of a baby mastodon.
Oh my gosh. That's cool.
Yeah. And so we knew that this cave hadn't been explored, and we knew that there were lots of things to explore once they got inside. And it took a few years. I guess it was discovered when I was a freshman, and I was able to go on trips when I was a junior. And they decided to send the college group that I was in up a lead that they thought was going to be a dead end. The dead end passage was going upstream, away from the main river that flowed through the cave. And they sent us exploring up there. And what we had to do was kind of climb up, about a 12-foot climb up into the ceiling. That was a pretty easy climb. I think we put a hand line down just to make it easier. One person going up. But then we started the survey, and it was my first time learning how to survey a cave. It was just one continuous passage where we started. And I was kind of in the lead while the other people were reading instruments and collecting all the measurements that they needed to do. And I realized at one point that I was climbing over rocks and climbing into this big passageway that was 50 foot wide, 50 foot high, 100 foot long rooms that I was exploring, and realized that I had been the first person ever to explore this room.
What was that like?
There aren't really words for that. And this is in West Virginia, so under cattle farms. So the fact that these places still exist, and they still exist nearby, I think I learned along the way that there are plenty of places that you don't have to travel the world to see. Caving was a sport that I got into because it was inexpensive. The big expense was the travel money for gas driving back and forth. And so if that's your biggest expense, then it's a much more accessible sport than a lot of others that you've talked to people about, or adventures that one takes around the world. There are lots of things to be seen around the world, but there are lots of things to be found in your backyard. Yeah. And I think that's one of the big takeaways I got from that trip early on.
That's really cool. Have you explored caves around the world?
When you say explored caves, I've explored caves, unmapped caves that I've worked on mapping throughout the United States and Mexico, and a little bit in Mexico, but I've visited caves in other countries around the world. But it's not quite the same when we don't know that you're the first person in it, and you don't know that I can't say that I was the explorer. I can say I'm exploring the caves. Explorer's kind of because I didn't have a map.
I gotcha.
But I've been able to explore caves in the oldest commercial cavern in the United States, which was opened in 1804. But
which one's that?
It's called Grand Caverns in Virginia. Okay. And Grand Caverns had been a commercial cavern since 1804. And 200 years later, we discovered that the cave was actually about 3 times longer than they knew about. As we were remapping it, we discovered some passages along the way, and I got to be the first person to photograph some of that. And so that really got me more interested in the photography, although carrying the photography gear through those very tight passages. I'm really glad that I had some small friends along to help move the gear along.
Is that a goal when you go into a cave, that you really would prefer or like to be exploring somewhere that really no one else has gotten to before?
I think goal is kind of, I'm always looking for the new stuff, but that's because we're looking to understand the entire cave. And to understand the entire cave, I might not be able to fit everywhere in the cave, but I spent some time. One of my first big cave maps that I drew, I was so proud of it. 2.5 miles of cave and 50 different loops in the cave. So I chose to work on that cave because I realized that I loved the maze that it took you in all different directions and 4 different levels, 3-dimensional loops and things like that. But then when I was showing off the map, we found another room.
Yeah. I gotcha. So this may be a very unintelligent question, but how do you not get confused and turned around spatially when you're in a new place that you don't have a map and there's no like exit signs?
How do I do that? It's a talent. It's magical talent that I've been granted. And if you've been on a trip with me, I will probably convince you that I have this magical talent at some
I'm
point.
catching a little sarcasm maybe here.
I was on trips early when I was in college with a friend of mine, and we're still friends 40 years later and still take vacations together and things like that. But she had a good sense of where we had been, and I had a good sense of where the direction for the entrance. And we discovered that one time that she remembered the way that we had gone, but I remembered the way to the entrance. And then we happened across a group that had a map and found out we were both right.
Okay.
So I do try to keep a sense of that. I do recognize that oftentimes getting into the cave is harder than getting back out again for me. I do take the time while I'm caving to look back as we're going into rooms and making up rules about what this room is. And a lot of people don't realize that I'm doing that because I talk a lot during the trips. And if I get a conversation going, I'm like, oh, this is the room where we talked about the hippopotamus.
Gotcha.
And so I call this the hippopotamus room in the back of my head.
So it's like leaving little mental breadcrumbs along the way?
That's the way that I do it.
Okay.
Not everyone does it that way, and I don't know if I could even process my way through a complicated cave without talking to people along the way.
I see. Have you ever gone into one of these trips and felt like you pushed yourself too far?
Too far might be in caves. Too far, the way I understand that best is too far is when my chest doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. And I am willing to do things. I don't recognize my size, and I can watch a small person, the person I've caved with for 40 years, she's only 95 pounds. So she can fit through things that I don't. And I think I didn't realize till afterwards when we were in a cave one time, and she said, "Oh, that looks too small. You go first."
Yeah. How tall are you?
I'm 6'2" now, 6'3"
Broad
before.
Shoulders.
Yeah, broad shoulders.
Not a small guy.
Not a small guy at all. But a lot of beginners are like, well, yeah, if Ken fits, I can fit. So I don't have trouble convincing them of that. What I have trouble with is knowing when I absolutely won't fit through something. So there are places that I have resigned myself to. Yes, smaller people will explore this, and I'll never get to see what's beyond.
I see.
but there are also places that I find I'm like, oh, if only there was another way around. And I've gone to great lengths to explore these places. I mentioned Grand Caverns before, and to get through the small hole in that, no one thought I would fit through. However, to get through it, I tried it one time wearing my caving coveralls that are made with Cordura or ballistic fabrics and things like that. And I was sandwiched between the floor and the ceiling and had to breathe out to move an inch. And it was still catching. Everything was catching along the way on the ceiling and on the floor. And it was so much work just to move an inch at a time. And I realized that I wasn't getting through that way. So what I did was I came back on another trip, laid down a plastic painter's sheet on the floor, stripped off the coveralls down to my long underwear, and slid right through. And had some friends, the small friends, bringing my gear along for me. They were really kind to help me out, but that got me through and got the photography to the other side.
I see. So that was one of the questions that I had in mind, was like an example of problem solving along the way. That's a really unique way to problem solve. Not on the same trip. You came back and
the cave was still there.
The cave was still there. So are there any, going back to the orienteering through a cave without a map, have there ever been any points where, I don't want to say you lost your way. Obviously, you're sitting here, you got out of every cave that you went into.
Oh, you figured that out.
Yeah, that's smart. But have there been any moments where you just really were turned around and had to figure out a way to work your way back through the breadcrumbs?
There are. The idea is to find something that you are more familiar with, but usually I've managed to recognize if I have to take the same path backwards, it's not so bad. It's when you get into a loop and you're like, wait, how did I get here? Now, do I go all the way back the way I came to get to this room again, or do I know where I am? So it's more trying to keep track of some of those things in your head and recognizing those are the ones that would be really cool to have a map of, especially when they're three-dimensional. But three-dimensional mazes can be really complicated. And I guess what I'd answer to your lost is sometimes what's annoying is when I can see where I want to be, but I've got to cross a canyon or something like that to get there. And it's like, no, this isn't the right way. I have to do this at a higher level or a lower level. No, I have to go back and figure that out. And I think that's been a situation in a couple of cases, but I don't think it's been adrenaline filled, if that's what you're asking for, because adrenaline doesn't help in those situations.
Yeah, I can completely see how that would be the case. It wasn't necessarily the fear or the adrenaline, but it was more about, I can only imagine these aren't super easy things that you're doing. And from time to time, you might get stuck, not physically stuck, but just kind of stuck and having to reorient yourself to where you're at. So that's really where the angle was coming from. And I think you answered it. If you weren't able to do caving, what would you be missing in your life?
Sorry, this is a question that does go kind of deep, because 2 years ago I had some foot injuries. I couldn't walk on anything that wasn't level. And so I wasn't sure what that was going to mean for me at the time. And where would I be going? I have to seriously consider that. The focus at that time and the focus anywhere along this has always been on the fact that the cavers I know cave into their 80s, and then they still have a place in the community, because it's a pretty tight-knit community. It's a small community of people who are dedicated to doing this for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And I think there are still places for me in that community, but there aren't. I would definitely miss the solace that I find within the caves, and definitely would miss the fact that the sense of the present moment that you were talking about. Because when I can go away for the weekend and look at the rocks in the wall and realize that they're hundreds of millions of years old, Mondays kind of melt away.
I love that.
Yeah, the Mondays at the office will just totally melt away from you.
Do you get that solace, and I forget the other descriptive word you used, but the sense of awe and wonder, do you get that in other places in your life or other things that you do outside of a cave?
I can, but I don't think that they are often able to be clouded by the rest of the world or fleeting, because they may come and go and it's hard to just kind of absorb them. But when you're in a cave, you are not moving quickly. When you're hiking, you get to a vantage point. I don't tend to hang out at the vantage points for a long time unless I'm doing photography. So the photography is also a way to step into the moment and the experience at that time, where oftentimes I'm, okay, I've done this, now I can do this and move on to the next thing. So it really does not force, but it allows for more moments of taking in, experiencing the awe.
Yeah, and you mentioned it too, the sense of community that you have in doing these things is not to be downplayed either. I mean, that, whether we look at it from an angle of if you didn't have it, that would be a loss, but you do have it, and so you do have that sense of community. That seems to be pretty important to you as well, like a big part of how your life functions today. And would you agree with that it is a very important piece?
Yeah, and a lot of it is that I kind of, a lot of people describe it as finding your clan.
Oh, yeah.
And I've heard that before. It's like, oh yeah, I was on a trip with cavers hiking in Peru, but trekking in Peru, and one of them told me, it's like, she was very involved in her background in Unitarian Universalism, and until she found the cavers, and then she found that the caves and the cavers were her clan and were the place that she really belonged, and was kind of able to leave some of the other things behind.
I think that is a worthy goal for any of us in anything that we do, is to find our people that we can feel connected to and accepted by. And if you can do that, do something that you love and enjoy with those people, then that's it. That is really, really special. I have one quick question on the Peru trip. And really it's more about, again, maybe an ignorant question, but are the caves different? Do they look different? Do they feel different? Is the experience different in different parts of the world compared to going to West Virginia or Virginia?
The caves, there are some incredible things I've seen in caves around the world, to the few places I've traveled. The big difference is that in West Virginia and Virginia, you notice that it's a certain temperature in the 50s, and, the bottle, and it's wet and damp. If you go out west, the caves are dry and don't quite seem to be alive. The formations are often dry. So you do find some differences, but in Tasmania, I got to see a 9-foot long soda straw. And
I don't know what that is. What?
Yeah, soda straw is something that looks like a soda straw formation. It's before a stalactite begins. It begins as something with just a drop of water and then a ring around the edge. And it's the same size as a soda straw might be. Okay. And they're pure white or translucent. I've seen them in the cave that I mentioned earlier, first exploring. They're 6 foot long, but I had never seen something hanging all the way down that was like 9 foot long in commercial caverns. So, there's something to be said for the size. I spent a week exploring Carlsbad caverns, or helping them to map and remap Carlsbad caverns just along the tourist trails. Mm-hmm. And there were some incredible things to see in terms of their size. And there's certainly a difference in the animals and the species that you find inside. So there are lots of differences, but I don't know if that makes me... I appreciate things when I see something new. I'd never seen swallows in a cave, but Carlsbad has the cave swallows that take off during the day. And that was incredible to watch the swallows. There are lots of things to observe, but I don't know if it makes the caves all that different, but sometimes there are lots of individual things.
Yeah. But you said at the very beginning, even though there are differences that you can experience around the world, you feel like you've got your fill of what you want and need just local. It's kind of a different way to shop local.
Right. Right.
By exploring local.
Right. And, from an environmental point of view, it helps me understand I start thinking about carbon footprints and things like that.
Sure. Yep.
And so if I can carpool with friends out to caves in Virginia and West Virginia, that's certainly a smaller carbon footprint that I place on the world.
Yeah. And I would imagine planning for these things, you obviously have to plan ahead. You've made it, whatever amount of money it costs to do this, you've made it a priority, a part of your cash flow. Have you ever had to not do something else because this was such a priority for you?
I don't think that's a great question. In other words, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah. But it has been a priority for how you allocate your money, and you've been doing it for so long.
No, it's still a low-cost sport. And so, I've been able to use my money for charities and charitable things instead. I mean, I do like to donate occasionally to helping protect the caves. And so in the world that we live in today, people value property in the U.S. a lot differently than they did 50, 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so there are many cave land conservancies that have started up, and I enjoy funding those. And I enjoy when I think the local chapter of the National Speleological Society here actually contributed to one of the cave being donated. The 2.5 mile cave I was talking about earlier was actually donated to the National Speleological Society. Things like that the landowner just saw some value in making that into a charitable donation.
That's really neat.
He could write off on his taxes.
Not a bad deal for everybody.
Right.
Yeah, that's really cool. And stewardship is a cool way to think about it, that whether we allocate money or time or any other resource towards taking care of the things that need to last, I think that's a really neat way to look at it. And for a low-cost sport, you've been able to do it for a long time. And have you had to use vacation time to do it, or have you been able to do most of it over weekends?
Most of it's been done over the weekends.
That's cool.
But
that's really neat.
When I want to take a vacation that gets me away from everything, I've signed up for trips with the Cave Research Foundation. And the Cave Research Foundation works with the national parks and national forests, and they will provide the lodging, and we just provide the food. They provide us access to the caves and to help them understand their caves better, and from a scientific point of view. So
it's vacation with a purpose.
It's vacation with a purpose, and it's kind of nice because I can go along and be the person. I'm not the leader on those trips.
That's got to be nice.
Oh, I love it when I can just sit back and follow orders, along the way. And it's like, and then chop up things for dinner and things like that. That's where I get big vacations, as opposed to, I can't imagine the people that plan expeditions. They're getting something different out of it. Than I am.
Makes sense. So to kind of put a bow on this, what do you have coming up, or what are you thinking about doing that you're excited about?
Right now I'm planning a photography trip where instead of focusing on the cave, I'm going to try and focus on the people.
Oh, that's different take.
It's hard photography because I don't have professional models. And I have people along that really get what they look like and how their poses affect the photo. But it's hard for me to sometimes translate into words what that should look like. I need you to raise this shoulder or something like that to make the picture look just right. And then the lighting is a huge challenge underground because you have complete control of lighting, which is great. Mm-hmm. And you have complete control of lighting, which means that you're screwed.
Difficult.
Right, because everything can get in the way, can be burnt out. Faces have been a challenge. Yours would not be because you've got a beard.
That's easier to photograph?
Underground. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
They don't get burnt down in the pictures quite so often.
Okay. That's very interesting. So where is this trip going to be?
To West Virginia.
Okay.
So a couple of weeks out. I've got some other things going on before then.
Yeah.
So,
well, for anybody that's listening that's never been in a cave before, how would you encourage them to consider it?
I'd encourage them to get in touch with their local chapter of the NSS, the National Speleological Society, at caves.org. You can look up your local groups. Our group here in the Triangle has been around since 1989. So They are mostly stable, but I say mostly stable in terms of sometimes some years we have more trips going out than others, but it all kind of takes on the feel of what people want to do. And I think that it's a great way to meet people who are interested in the same thing and try something new.
Yeah. And you have newbies that come out of all ages?
Yeah. I've taken 2-year-olds caving for the first time and 70-year-olds caving for people in their 70s for the first time.
That is quite the range.
So it definitely ranges. I guess I've even taken younger children. There was one that we had to hand through the passages because she was only 6 months old. She was too young, but the parents insisted on taking her into a fairly easy cave. But there were some duck unders. Fortunately, we had a baby doctor along who knew how to handle.
Yeah. That's really cool. Very cool. Well, Ken, I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been a very wide-ranging conversation, which I loved. And a big takeaway for me, not being a person that has really ever been involved with theater, photography, or caving of any sort, there's still that common thread of curiosity, presence, and wonder and awe. And I certainly want those things in my life and the different things that I do pursue. And I hope anybody listening can see the same thing and hear the same thing from you as well. So I appreciate being generous with your time this morning.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Okay. Man, I really enjoyed that. I hope you did as well. The next one will be coming at you in a couple weeks, so stay tuned. Until then, I hope you have your own great adventure.